Keanu Reeves walked into the bank that afternoon, a place he'd been to countless times before, but this time it felt different. The marble floors, the shiny glass doors, the faint scent of expensive cologne in the air, it all seemed so ordinary. He was just another man in line, just another customer dealing with his finances, or at least that's how he hoped it would be. He wasn't dressed in anything fancy. A simple black hoodie, a pair of jeans, and a baseball cap that shaded his face. He was doing his best to blend in, to keep things low-key. His mission was straightforward: solve a few minor banking issues and be on his way, but that wasn't going to be the case. As he approached the counter, a young woman behind it looked up from her computer screen, eyes scanning him briefly, before a forced smile spread across her face. Her nameplate read Sarah. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, the tone of her voice barely hiding her disinterest. She didn't recognize him, not even a hint of recognition in her eyes. To her, he was just another customer in the endless sea of daily transactions. Keanu cleared his throat. "I'd like to speak to someone about a personal account issue. Nothing too complicated." Sarah nodded, but there was no urgency in her movements, no genuine care. She flicked through a few papers, scanning for something, perhaps her next customer, perhaps something to distract her from this conversation. "All right," she said flatly. "You'll need to provide more information. I'll need your account number and your ID." Keanu frowned. Something about her demeanor rubbed him the wrong way, but he didn't react. Instead, he patiently pulled out his wallet and handed her his ID. She glanced at the ID and back at him, an eyebrow slightly raised. "Keanu Reeves, really?" she muttered with a half-sarcastic smile. "This is your real name?" "Yes, that's my name," Keanu replied, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Now, about the issue with my account." Sarah ignored the tension in his voice, still distracted. She typed something into the computer, her fingers clacking away on the keyboard. Her eyes flicked between the screen and him, clearly uninterested in the person standing in front of her. "So, what's the issue?" she asked as she continued her work, not even looking at him. "I need to know exactly what you're trying to do here." Keanu paused, trying to suppress the irritation bubbling up inside him. He wasn't sure what it was about this woman's complete lack of professionalism that bothered him the most, the way she dismissed him so easily, or the fact that she was so oblivious to who he was. It felt like a punch in the gut, not that he would ever let it show. "I've been dealing with some discrepancies in my account," Keanu said, trying to keep his cool. "I need to sort it out as quickly as possible," but Sarah wasn't paying full attention. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, looking over her shoulder and chatting with a colleague who had just walked by. The way she casually dismissed him, without even bothering to ask any real questions, made Keanu feel invisible. And that was exactly how he hated feeling, like no one took him seriously, like his presence didn't matter. Keanu took a deep breath. "Stay calm," he told himself. This was just a misunderstanding, nothing more. But Sarah wasn't done. "You know," she said, turning back to him with a mocking grin, "people who usually come in here with problems like this, they don't really have it together. Are you sure you have everything you need? Maybe you should check again and come back when you're more organized." Keanu stared at her for a beat. Did she really just say that? He wasn't sure if it was her tone, her arrogance, or the fact that she didn't even recognize him. But something inside him snapped. For the first time, he felt the weight of being underestimated, and to him that was one of the worst feelings in the world. "You're being rude," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I think you got the wrong idea about me." Sarah, clearly not sensing the shift in the air, shrugged casually. "I'm just saying, some people need to be more prepared. You might want to try again another time." Keanu's jaw clenched. He could feel the tension in the room building. This wasn't how things were supposed to go, but then, just as quickly as the anger rose, Keanu held it in check. He had dealt with far worse. In his life, this was nothing. "At least not yet. Can I speak to someone else?" Keanu asked, his voice maintaining that level-headed calmness. Sarah looked at him with a dismissive glance, seemingly unfazed. "Sure, you can wait in line with the others," she said, turning her attention back to her computer screen. but it'll be a while." Keanu stared at her for a long moment. There was no point in arguing further with someone who didn't care, but there was something else he knew now, the kind of person Sarah was, the kind of place this bank might be. And it wasn't the kind of place he wanted to do business with. He took a slow breath and turned to walk away, but just before he left, something inside him stirred. He was done letting people like Sarah walk over him. But little did Sarah know, Keanu wasn't just any customer. He was the owner of the bank. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu stepped away from the counter, his mind racing. He didn't want to make a scene, but he also couldn't let this slide. He had been humiliated in front of everyone in the bank, and the last thing he wanted was to be treated like some nobody. He wandered over to the corner, trying to cool off, but the thought of Sarah's dismissive attitude kept gnawing at him. She didn't even recognize me. How could she not know who I am? Keanu thought to himself, his fingers idly tapping on his phone. Minutes ticked by, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't right. Finally, after a few long minutes, he spotted the head of the bank's management team, a middle-aged man named James, walking down the hallway toward the main office. Keanu wasn't sure if he was the right person to talk to, but at this point, he didn't care. He was ready to escalate things. As James neared, Keanu stepped up. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his voice polite but firm. "I need to speak to someone in charge of this branch immediately." James paused, looking at Keanu with the same blank expression everyone else had given him earlier. "Sure, I'm James," he replied, offering a hand for Keanu to shake. "What seems to be the problem, sir?" Keanu shook his hand but quickly got to the point. "I just had a very unpleasant experience at your counter with one of your employees. Her name is Sarah. She was rude, dismissive, and unprofessional, and frankly, I didn't appreciate the way I was treated." James blinked, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I'm really sorry to hear that," he said, "but I assure you that's not the standard of service we provide here. If you'd like, I can get Sarah to apologize for her behavior, and we can work through whatever issue you were facing." Keanu's patience was wearing thin. "It's not just about the service, James. I've been a customer of this bank for a long time, and I own a sizable portion of its shares. But right now I'm wondering if I even want to stay with a bank that lets its employees treat people this way. The way Sarah spoke to me, like I was some second-class citizen, was just unacceptable." James's face shifted slightly. There was a moment of recognition in his eyes, though he tried to mask it quickly. "Well, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding here, Mr. Reeves." He paused for a beat, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. "I'll make sure to look into this, and I'll handle it personally." Keanu's eyebrow quirked slightly, but he didn't let it show. "You do that," he said coolly, before turning on his heel. As he made his way back to the counter, he overheard some hushed whispers from the other customers in line. They were all looking at him now, some with curiosity, some with disbelief. "How do they not know who I am?" Keanu wondered again, feeling a strange mix of frustration and disbelief. Keanu glanced back at Sarah, who was still behind the counter, tapping away at her keyboard, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. Her indifference was like a slap in the face. His frustration only grew as he waited. How could someone like her, so dismissive and rude, not even recognize the person she had just insulted? It was a bizarre reality check for Keanu, a reminder that fame and wealth didn't always shield you from people's poor behavior, even in places where you should feel respected. As he stood there, another employee came over to Sarah's station. Keanu overheard their conversation. "Hey, did you see that guy who just walked in? He looks like a movie star or something," the other employee remarked. Sarah didn't even look up. "Yeah, he probably just wants special treatment like all the others," she responded with a scoff. "I'm so over people trying to act like they're important around here." Keanu's blood began to boil again, but he quickly calmed himself. No need to escalate this further. But he was done. Done with being ignored. Done with being underestimated. If Sarah didn't recognize who he was, he'd show her just how wrong she was. Keanu walked back over to the front desk, this time with a different air about him. He didn't care anymore if people were whispering, staring, or speculating. He wasn't just Keanu Reeves, the actor. Today, he was Keanu Reeves, the owner of this bank, and it was time people learned to respect that. He stood at the counter waiting for Sarah to look up from her work. It took her a moment, but finally she noticed him standing there, staring at her. Her gaze faltered when she realized it was the same man she'd just dismissed. Can I help you with something else?" Sarah said, her tone a bit sharper now, as though she could sense the shift in the air. Keanu leaned forward, his voice calm but carrying weight. "Actually, Sarah, I think you can. You see, I'm not just any customer here. I own this bank." Sarah's eyes widened, her hands momentarily freezing on the keyboard. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Keanu smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "And I don't tolerate the kind of treatment you just gave me. Not from anyone. Especially not from someone who works for me." There was a long pause, filled only by the murmurs of the other customers who were watching the exchange unfold. Sarah looked around nervously, realizing just how far her actions had gone. This wasn't just any customer, and that was when it hit her. The man standing before her wasn't just some actor, some movie star who had wandered in off the street. He was the one who owned the bank, the same bank she worked for. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? Keanu's words hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm cloud waiting to break. The shift in Sarah's expression was instantaneous. Her face paled, and she fumbled with her mouse as if it might somehow offer her a way out of the sudden, uncomfortable reality she had created. For a moment there was only silence, the kind of silence that only comes when someone realizes they've made a massive mistake. Around them, the room had grown quieter. A few customers glanced over, whispering behind their hands, some with expressions of surprise, others with curiosity. Keanu could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't care. His focus was entirely on Sarah and the way her demeanor had changed in the blink of an eye. "You own the bank?" Sarah stammered, her words tripping over themselves. Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I do. I'm Keanu Reeves, and this is my bank. And you, Sarah, just insulted me." He could see the gears turning in her mind as she processed what he had just said. Her fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard, as if she was trying to find a way to apologize without actually doing it. But Keanu wasn't done. "You see," he continued, "I'm not upset because I'm famous. I'm not upset because I have some VIP status. I'm upset because I expect the same level of respect and professionalism here that I would expect anywhere else, whether I'm a customer or the owner. And you failed on both fronts." A few people in line looked from Sarah to Keanu, their eyes wide, realizing the full gravity of the situation. They had witnessed the way Sarah had treated him earlier, and now the truth was finally coming out. Keanu wasn't just a famous actor. He was the man who held the power over this entire institution. Sarah looked down, her face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't know," she muttered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves. I honestly didn't." "Mean to—" Keanu cut her off, raising a hand to stop her. "It's not about me, Sarah. It's about respect. You've just learned a valuable lesson. You can't judge a book by its cover. Not everyone who walks through these doors is just another customer." He let the words sink in for a moment before adding, "And now you'll have to live with the consequences." The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah's embarrassment was so thick you could almost feel it, but Keanu wasn't done yet. He had to make a point, not just to Sarah, but to everyone who had witnessed this encounter. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the room to the other employees, all of whom were now watching the unfolding drama with wide eyes. They had been silent witnesses to the fallout, and Keanu knew it was time to make sure they understood what was at stake here. "Want you all to hear me clearly," he said, his voice firm, his eyes scanning the room. "This is a bank that is built on trust and respect, both for the customers and for the employees. There will be no more tolerating behavior like this. I expect every single one of you to treat people with dignity, no matter who they are. From this point forward, anyone who disrespects another person, no matter their status, will have to answer to me." There was a long pause as the employees exchanged uncertain glances. Keanu had just drawn a line in the sand, and now it was clear. Sarah's actions were just the beginning of a much larger shift. Sarah stood frozen at the counter, her face still, burning with humiliation, and for a moment Keanu felt a flicker of sympathy. She was young, she had made a mistake, one that had cost her a great deal. But that didn't change the fact that she needed to learn this lesson the hard way. "You'll be hearing from my HR team soon, Sarah," Keanu said. His tone softened just enough to show he wasn't completely cold. "I'm not going to fire you immediately. But consider this a warning." As he turned to leave, he heard Sarah's voice tremble behind him. "Mr. Reeves, I'm so sorry, I'll do better." Keanu didn't look back. "I hope you will," he said quietly, walking out of the bank. As he stepped into the fresh air outside, Keanu took a deep breath. It was over. He had made his point, but it had come at a cost. For a brief moment, he had wondered if he had gone too far. After all, Sarah was just doing her job in her own way, even if it was a job that didn't involve any recognition of his importance. But as the cool breeze hit his face, he realized that no, he hadn't gone too far. What had happened wasn't about him. It was about how people treat others, regardless of who they are. And it was a lesson he wanted everyone to learn. But little did he know this wasn't the end of the story. There was something much bigger at play here. Something that would soon come to light, and it would make him question everything about his involvement with the bank. Back inside the bank, the employees were left to reflect on the power shift that had just occurred. They had learned, in the most unexpected way, that their actions and their attitudes had consequences. Sarah stood there, still processing the fact that she had just been humiliated by a man she had no idea was her boss. Her mind raced as she tried to come to terms with what had just happened. But deep down she knew one thing. Her life was about to change, and the lessons she'd learned today would stay with her for a long time. The next day, Keanu woke up to a storm of messages flooding his inbox. Emails, phone calls, text messages, all from the bank's executive team, each one more urgent than the last. It seemed like the ripple effect from his encounter with Sarah had spread throughout the organization. He had intended to send a message about respect and professionalism, but he never imagined it would escalate like this. After going over his emails, Keanu felt a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. He wasn't just dealing with the fallout from one employee's mistake anymore. There were deeper layers at play, something felt off. He had the sense that this incident was the first crack in something much larger, a problem he hadn't fully grasped yet. Keanu sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands, his thoughts racing. As an actor, he'd spent much of his life in the public eye, learning how to navigate media attention, manage relationships, and deal with the pressure of constant scrutiny. But this was different. This wasn't about his public image. It wasn't about the fans or the tabloids. It was about something real. The people who worked for him, the institution he had put so much trust into, and the power dynamics that up until now had remained out of his direct sight. Keanu, his assistant Grace, called through the phone, interrupting his thoughts. "We've got a meeting scheduled with the executive board at 11 a.m. They're waiting for you." Keanu glanced at the clock. He had 30 minutes before the meeting started. He didn't feel prepared, not by a long shot. But then again, the only way to truly be prepared was to confront the issues head-on. As he made his way to the bank's headquarters, Keanu's mind swirled. He couldn't shake the feeling that this had all been building for a while. His encounter with Sarah was merely the trigger. The real issue ran deeper. He could sense it now, like an undercurrent he hadn't noticed before. When Keanu arrived at the sleek, glass-fronted building, the usual formalities and pleasantries of business had already begun. His arrival was met with hushed whispers and quiet murmurs. It was clear that word of his actions yesterday had already spread through the staff. Inside the executive boardroom, the tension was thick. Keanu could feel the unease in the air as soon as he stepped inside. The board members, most of them seasoned professionals, sat around the long mahogany table, all looking at him with varying degrees of discomfort. Mr. Reeves, the CEO of the bank, Samuel Grant, greeted him, his voice polite but stiff. "Thank you for joining us today. We've all reviewed the situation from yesterday, and we'd like to discuss the best course of action moving forward." Keanu nodded, taking his seat at the head of the table. His eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of each board member. He knew they were nervous. After all, he had just publicly scolded one of their employees in front of customers. They weren't sure how to handle him now, and they certainly weren't sure what he expected from them. "Before we get into any specifics," Keanu began, his voice calm but commanding, "I just want to be clear about something. Yesterday wasn't just about Sarah or her behavior. It wasn't about me being treated poorly either. This is about the kind of bank we want to be, the kind of culture we want to create. Respect is non-negotiable. No one should ever feel belittled or dismissed, not in this bank, and not in any other institution I'm involved in." The room fell silent. Keanu had their full attention now. He wasn't the actor speaking to the press. He wasn't the public figure with a reputation to protect. He was the owner of this bank, and they had just seen a side of him they weren't used to, one that was deeply invested in the people who worked for him, in the ethics of the business. "I understand that mistakes happen," Keanu continued. "But yesterday's incident wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a larger problem, an issue of how we treat our customers and each other. And it's not just Sarah. It's the attitudes that have taken root in this place, attitudes that allow poor behavior to slide by unchecked. That needs to change." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Samuel Grant, the CEO, cleared his throat. "We agree with you, Mr. Reeves, and we are taking this matter seriously. We've already begun looking into the incident with Sarah, and we're reviewing our internal training and procedures. However, there's something else we need to discuss." Keanu raised an eyebrow, signaling for Samuel to continue. "We've been looking into the bank's long-term financial strategy," Samuel said, shifting in his seat, "and there are some concerns among the board about your level of involvement. You haven't been attending board meetings as regularly as expected, and there's been some talk about whether your focus has shifted away from the day-to-day operations of the bank." Keanu's expression darkened slightly. So this was what they wanted to address. "I've been busy with other projects," Keanu said, his tone cool but controlled. "But that doesn't mean I'm not involved. I've trusted all of you to run this bank, and I expect you to continue doing so. But make no mistake, I'm watching. And if things don't change, if you don't uphold the values that I believe in, I will step in. And when I do, it won't be pretty." The room went still. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly weighing the gravity of his words. Keanu wasn't just an absentee owner who popped in occasionally. He was a force to be reckoned with, and they knew it. "What I'm asking," Keanu continued, his voice softer now, "is for all of you to take a step back and reassess what kind of bank you want to be. This isn't just about profits. It's about the people we serve, the employees, the customers, everyone. If we don't get that right, the rest doesn't matter." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, the board members nodded, acknowledging his point. The tension that had once filled the room began to dissipate. "Understood," Samuel said, leaning forward. "We'll do everything we can to address this, Mr. Reeves." Keanu leaned back in his chair, a slight sigh escaping him. "Good. I'm glad to hear that. Let's make sure we follow through." As the meeting adjourned, Keanu left the room with a sense of purpose. He wasn't just an actor trying to manage a business from the sidelines. He was a man determined to reshape the very foundation of the company he owned. This was just the beginning. But even as he walked out of the room, a small seed of doubt lingered in his mind. Something still felt off. What had caused the disconnect in the first place? And just as quickly, the answer hit him. There was something bigger going on here. Something far more intricate than just bad customer service or poor management. But he was determined to find out. The following weeks felt like a whirlwind for Keanu. The bank's executive team scrambled to implement new changes, new policies, and new training programs, everything that he had demanded after his meeting with them. Sarah was put on leave while an internal investigation into her behavior was conducted, and Keanu was now more involved in the day-to-day operations of the bank than ever before. But despite the changes, something still didn't sit right with him. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper problem lurking beneath the surface. The more he immersed himself in the bank's operations, the more he noticed discrepancies in the way things were being run. Certain departments weren't performing as they should. Customer complaints about long wait times were rising. and there was a general sense of unease among employees. Despite the outward appearance of smooth transitions and change, the tension was palpable. Then one day, Keanu received a phone call that would change everything. It was Grace, his assistant, her voice unusually tense. "Keanu, you need to come to the bank immediately," she said urgently. "We've just had a serious situation come up. There's something you need to see." His heart skipped a beat. "What happened? Is it Sarah again?" "No," Grace replied, her tone lowered. "It's worse. It's the financials, the discrepancies you've been seeing. They're not just mistakes." Keanu's mind raced. "What are you talking about, Grace? I'll explain when you get here. Just please hurry." The line went dead, and Keanu stood still for a moment, the weight of the call settling over. "Him?" His gut twisted. "This is it," he thought. "The thing I've been feeling in the air. It's not just bad management, it's something worse." He grabbed his coat and rushed to the bank, the drive there feeling longer than usual. His mind was a blur of possibilities. What had Grace uncovered? What could possibly be so urgent? The deeper he thought about it, the more he realized just how little he really knew about the inner workings of the bank. When he arrived, Grace was waiting for him outside the executive offices. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and frustration. She didn't speak as he walked up to her. She simply gestured for him to follow her inside. As they entered the boardroom, Keanu could feel the heavy tension in the air. The atmosphere was different, strained, almost suffocating. The board members were there, as were a few senior members of the accounting department. Grace immediately handed Keanu a stack of financial reports, their edges bent and marked with red ink. "These are the reports we've been reviewing," Grace said, her voice tight. "And what we've found isn't just mismanagement, it's fraud." Keanu felt his stomach drop. Fraud? How could that be possible? He took the reports from her hands, scanning through the numbers, his eyes darting from one line to the next. There were discrepancies everywhere, missing funds, strange transfers, accounts that didn't add up. But it was the final page that made his blood run cold. It showed a series of transactions between the bank and a company that had been operating under false pretenses, a company with connections to several board members. "Who's behind this?" Keanu asked, his voice low, a sharp edge to it. Grace hesitated before speaking. "It looks like someone in the upper management, Keanu. A coordinated effort. They've been siphoning off funds for months, maybe even longer." The room was silent as the gravity of the revelation settled in. Keanu looked around, his gaze hardening. He had trusted these people, these very individuals who had been sitting at that table with him just a few weeks ago, promising to make changes to clean up the bank. And now they were involved in a web of corruption that went deeper than he could have ever imagined. "Who else knows about this?" Keanu asked. His eyes locked on Samuel Grant, the CEO, who was sitting at the far end of the table. Samuel was silent for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice quiet and resigned. "Keanu, we didn't want you to find out like this. We were hoping to handle it internally, but now that you've seen the evidence, yes, several members of the board are involved." Keanu's jaw tightened. The betrayal stung. His trust, his faith in the bank and its leadership had been shattered. This wasn't just an isolated incident, this was systematic. These people had been taking advantage of him, using his name and reputation to line their own pockets. "How long has this been going on?" Keanu asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if he couldn't bear to hear the answer. "We've been covering our tracks for a while," Samuel admitted, his face red with shame. "But it's been escalating. And now with the way things have been changing at the bank, we knew we needed to act before it all came crashing down." Keanu shook his head, unable to process what he was hearing. The weight of the situation pressed on him, suffocating him with its implications. The trust he had placed in these people, in the institution he had built, had been betrayed on a scale he hadn't even imagined. But even in the face of this betrayal, Keanu knew one thing. He couldn't let it continue. He couldn't allow these people to get away with it. "I need you all to leave," Keanu said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "Effective immediately, I'm taking full control of the bank. I'm going to make sure this whole operation is cleaned up, starting with every single one of you. As of now, you're all suspended pending further investigation." The room went silent once again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from the realization that Keanu was no longer the actor who had just made a spectacle at a bank counter. He was the owner now, and he was about to wield that power like a weapon. He turned to Grace. "Contact the authorities. This goes beyond anything we can handle internally." As the board members stood up, filing out of the room, Keanu was left standing alone, staring at the financial reports that had shattered his world. The betrayal had been swift, but now the real battle was about to begin. In that moment, Keanu realized something he had never fully understood until now. Power, when placed in the wrong hands, could destroy everything it touched. But power in the right hands, his hands, could rebuild. And he would rebuild this bank. He would cleanse it from top to bottom. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, legal meetings, and high-stakes negotiations. Keanu had taken charge, reaching out to external auditors, lawyers, and investigators to unravel the web of corruption that had infested his bank. The more they uncovered, the more disturbing it became. Entire departments had been involved in fraudulent activities, manipulating accounts, laundering money, and funneling millions into offshore accounts. But Keanu remained undeterred. He had seen the darkest sides of the industry during his acting. Career had dealt with public scandals, personal loss, and betrayals before, but this was different. This wasn't just about personal reputation, it was about something far more important. This was about justice. This was about righting a wrong, on a grand scale. By the end of the week, several members of the board had been arrested. Samuel Grant, the CEO, was among those taken into custody. It felt surreal to Keanu, who had once trusted these people with everything: his vision for the bank, his money, and his name. The bank's headquarters, once a symbol of status and success, now felt like a hollow shell. Employees had been sent home while the investigation continued. Keanu knew that a lot of people had been unknowingly involved, but he also understood the price of ignoring the rot at the core. There would be consequences for everyone. Through all the chaos, Keanu's mind kept returning to one thing: the people who depended on the bank, the customers, the loyal employees who had worked diligently for years, often without realizing the corruption that surrounded them. He couldn't let their hard work be tainted by the actions of a few. One afternoon, after another grueling meeting with investigators, Keanu stood by the large window of his office, gazing out over the city. The skyline was beautiful, but it felt distant, almost foreign now. It was hard to shake the feeling that everything he thought he understood about the world of business, about his own values, had been tested in ways he never imagined. But the more he reflected, the clearer it became. This wasn't a loss. It was a chance for redemption, for him, for the bank, and for the people whose livelihoods depended on the institution he had built. "Keanu?" Grace's voice interrupted his thoughts. She stepped into the room holding a file in her hand. He turned toward her, his mind momentarily focused on her presence. She had been his right hand through this entire ordeal, always calm, always supportive. "How are we doing?" Keanu asked, his voice low but steady. Grace sighed as she set the file down on the desk. "The legal team is moving fast. They've arrested most of the suspects and the investigation is progressing. We're already making arrangements for the bank to continue operations without disruption. We'll need to restructure the board, though, and I think it's time to start thinking about who's going to replace them." Keanu nodded. He had already started to put together a short list of potential candidates, people who were trustworthy and capable of restoring the bank's integrity. It wouldn't be easy. Trust had been broken on so many levels, but he knew that in order to rebuild, he needed the right people in place. He picked up the file and flipped through the pages, skimming over the reports. His eyes landed on a few details that caught his attention. In particular, there was a mention of a potential investor, someone who had shown interest in supporting the bank during the restructure. Keanu's interest piqued. This could be the opportunity he needed to bring in fresh blood and move forward with a renewed sense of purpose. "Who is this investor?" Keanu asked, pointing to the name on the page. Grace glanced at the file and shrugged. It's a group based in New York. They've been in the financial world for years. They're looking for a project to get behind after their last venture went under, and they see potential in your vision. For the bank, they're interested in meeting with you." Keanu leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. A new partnership? It could be exactly what the bank needed. Someone with fresh ideas who could help them recover and thrive again. "Set up the meeting," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll talk to them. It's time to start rebuilding." As Grace left the room, Keanu stood up and walked over to the window once again. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was still with him. He couldn't undo the damage that had been done, but he could control how he responded. The bank would survive, and more importantly, it would thrive on his terms. Keanu understood, now more than ever, that leadership wasn't just about making money or cutting deals. It was about integrity. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. And it was about the people who trusted you, not just the customers or employees, but the communities that relied on the institution for their livelihoods. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the city, Keanu smiled to himself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would take time, patience, and hard work, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just the owner of a bank. He was a man who had faced betrayal, who had confronted corruption, and who was determined to make things right. Keanu had learned a powerful lesson through this journey. It's not the challenges that define you, it's how you respond to them. Weeks passed, and the city began to heal from the shockwaves of the scandal. News of the bank's internal corruption had spread quickly, but so had the story of its new leadership. Keanu's decisive actions in the face of betrayal had earned him the respect of many. He wasn't just a wealthy actor turned businessman. He was a man of principle, determined to rebuild what had been broken. The changes at the bank were immediate and sweeping. The old guard had been ousted, and the rebuilding process was well underway. Keanu had brought in a new CEO, Olivia Davis, a highly respected businesswoman with a track record of leading organizations through troubled times. She was tough but fair, and Keanu trusted her to take the reins while he continued to oversee the broader direction of the company. But rebuilding wasn't just about cleaning up the mess left behind by the fraud. Keanu knew it was also about restoring trust. Trust with the employees, the customers, and most importantly, the community that had once looked to the bank as a symbol of stability. Olivia had already started implementing transparency initiatives. She held town hall meetings with the employees, providing them with updates on the bank's recovery and answering their questions candidly. It was a stark contrast to the secretive top-down approach that had characterized the bank before. Employees appreciated the change, and morale began to improve. The most significant change, however, was Keanu's decision to implement a community-first policy. He knew that the bank's reputation had been severely damaged, but he believed that, by reconnecting with the community, they could rebuild not only their customer base, but also their identity. Keanu proposed a series of initiatives to support local businesses, offer financial education workshops, and provide scholarships for underprivileged students. While it was clear that these initiatives wouldn't solve everything overnight, they were a symbol of a larger shift in the bank's culture. It was a commitment to something bigger than profits, commitment to people. One day, as Keanu sat in his office reviewing the latest progress reports, he received a call from Grace. "Keanu, we've just received confirmation from that investor group in New York," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "They're offering us a substantial investment. They want to partner with us moving forward." Keanu felt a surge of hope. This was it, the turning point. The investment could provide the capital they needed to strengthen their position in the EE market and expand their efforts to rebuild. "That's great news, Grace," Keanu said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Set up a meeting with them as soon as possible. I want to hear what they're offering." The meeting with the investors was scheduled for the following week. Keanu, Olivia, and a few of the senior members of the team gathered in the conference room, waiting for the representatives from New York to arrive. Keanu had a lot riding on this meeting. While he had faith in his ability to turn things around, the investment would give them the leverage they needed to execute their vision on a larger scale. When the representatives arrived, they were led by Ethan Shaw, the CEO of the investment group. Ethan was a polished businessman in his mid-40s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude. He was the kind of person who had likely made billions, off gut instinct, and a ruthless approach to business. But Keanu wasn't intimidated. If anything, he felt more certain than ever that this was the kind of partnership the bank needed to move forward. The meeting began with pleasantries, but Keanu wasted no time getting down to business. He outlined his vision for the bank, a bank that would serve the community, foster ethical business practices, and prioritize customer trust above everything else. Ethan listened intently, occasionally nodding, but there was a skepticism in his eyes. Finally, after Keanu had presented his plans, Ethan spoke. "You're asking for a lot, Keanu. You're not just trying to fix a bank. You're trying to change an entire industry, and that's going to take more than just a few initiatives. It's going to take money, influence, and time." Keanu didn't flinch. "I know it's ambitious, but the world has changed. People want transparency, they want integrity. They want to trust the institutions they work with." Ethan leaned back in his chair, clearly evaluating the sincerity in Keanu's words. "That's the part I like. People want to believe in something. And you're right, the market has shifted. But it's also cutthroat. If you want our investment, you'll need to prove to us that you can handle the pressure. You can't just promise change, you need results." Keanu met his gaze unwavering. "I understand, but I'm not in this for a quick profit. I'm in it to make sure we're building something that lasts. And I'm willing to fight for that." The tension in the room hung thick for a moment, before Ethan finally spoke again. "All right, we'll back you, but we want a say in the direction of the company. We'll give you the resources, but you'll need to make sure you deliver." Keanu nodded. This was the deal he had been hoping for. He knew the partnership wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. The investors would provide the necessary financial support, but Keanu and his team would be the ones driving the vision forward. This was his moment to prove that he could not only recover the bank, but transform it into something that could set a new standard in the industry. As the meeting concluded and the investors left, Keanu stood at the window once more, looking out over the city. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of calm. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he had the resources, the team, and the willpower to succeed. He had turned a moment of humiliation into an opportunity to redefine everything he stood for, starting with the bank. The weeks following the investment deal were filled with frenetic energy. Keanu and Olivia worked tirelessly alongside their team to implement the changes they had discussed. They had new systems in place, a renewed focus on ethics and transparency, and a detailed plan to ensure the bank's future success. The capital from the New York investors had given them the means to implement their vision, but now the hard work began. Keanu was spending more time at the bank than ever before. He attended every meeting, reviewed every report, and met with employees at all levels to hear their concerns. He wanted to be more than just a figurehead. He wanted to be an active participant in the rebuilding process. He had learned through the scandal and his personal struggles that true leadership wasn't about sitting in an office and making high-level decisions from behind a desk. It was about being present. It was about understanding the challenges others were facing and offering support in any way he could. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting with the board, Keanu sat in his office alone, staring at the latest customer feedback reports. The responses were mixed. Some customers were hopeful about the changes, while others were more skeptical. It was understandable. After all, a bank's reputation wasn't rebuilt overnight. A knock at the door broke his concentration. "Come in," he called. Olivia walked in, holding a stack of documents. She smiled slightly when she saw him, but Keanu could see the fatigue in her eyes. They had both been burning the candle at both ends. "I've got the latest projections," Olivia said, handing him the stack of papers. "And I think we're on the right track. Customers are starting to return, and we've even had a few major accounts reach out to inquire about switching to us." Keanu skimmed through the documents, his mind already running through the implications. "This is good, but we need more than just a few inquiries. We need to show people that we're serious, that we can back up our promises with action. Olivia nodded. I agree, but we're getting there. The new initiatives are starting to take root. The community outreach programs are making a real impact. We're going to need time, but the momentum is building. Keanu set the documents down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and weariness. I'm not worried about the time. I'm worried about what happens when things get hard again. This is the test, Olivia. We've had a breakthrough with the investment. But what happens when the next challenge arises? What happens when the pressure mounts, when the media starts to question us again? When the naysayers come out of the woodwork? We need to be ready. Olivia crossed the room and sat across from him. Keanu, you're right. There will be setbacks. There will always be challenges. But what matters is how we handle them. We're building a foundation for something great, something that will last. If we hold true to our values, if we continue to put the community and our customers first, we will be just fine. Keanu nodded, absorbing her words. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. There would be many more hurdles to overcome. But he had learned to trust in the process, and most importantly in the people around him. That night, Keanu stayed late at the office, reviewing strategies for the upcoming quarter. He was determined to make the next phase of the bank's recovery a success. But as he glanced over the projections, something caught his eye. A line in one of the reports seemed off. A small anomaly in the financials. Nothing that immediately screamed fraud, but just enough to make him raise an eyebrow. He paused, picking up the phone and dialing Grace's number. Grace, I need you to double-check the numbers for the last quarter's business loan approvals. Something feels off, he said, his voice calm but with a tinge of concern. Got it, Keanu, Grace replied. I'll look into it and get back to you. Keanu hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. Just when he thought things were starting to settle, there was another whisper of doubt. It felt like déjà vu, a sense of unease creeping back into his chest. It was only a few hours later when Grace called back. Her voice was tight with concern. Keanu, I ran the numbers twice. There's a discrepancy. It looks like one of our loan officers may have been approving applications without proper due diligence. They've been rubber-stamping loans without fully verifying the information. Keanu's heart sank. Not again, not after everything they had been through. He had hoped that the internal systems they had put in place were enough to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. I need you to find out who's responsible, he said, his voice low, and I need you to do it fast. Grace promised she would get to work immediately. As Keanu hung up the phone, a sense of dread washed over him. It wasn't just about the money, it wasn't even about the potential scandal. It was about trust. Once again, someone at the bank had betrayed the values they were working so hard to instill. He had a choice to make. This was the test of his leadership. He couldn't afford to let this slide. He couldn't afford to take shortcuts or give in to complacency. The bank's future depended on his ability to handle the tough situations, to make the hard decisions that would show his commitment to change. The next day, Keanu met with Olivia and the rest of the leadership team to discuss the issue. They moved swiftly, addressing the loan officer's actions and suspending them pending a full investigation. The decision was difficult but necessary. We've made huge strides in rebuilding this bank, Keanu said, his voice resolute. But we can't afford to let anything undermine the work we've done. This is about showing our customers that we're serious, that we're reliable, and that we hold ourselves to the highest standards. It was a difficult meeting, but one that needed to be held. There would be fallout from the scandal, and it would take time to regain trust. But Keanu knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up now, not when they had come so far. And as the meeting concluded and the team set to work addressing the issue, Keanu once again found himself looking out over the city skyline. The road to recovery was never going to be easy, but it was a road he was willing to walk, no matter the challenges. The first rays of sunlight broke through the blinds of Keanu's office, casting a warm glow over the polished wooden desk where he sat. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of accomplishment. Despite all the obstacles, the setbacks, and the challenges, they had made it. The bank was on the verge of a complete turnaround. The scandal with the loan officer had been swiftly dealt with. Thanks to Keanu's firm yet fair approach, the matter had been handled with transparency. A thorough investigation was conducted and appropriate disciplinary action had been taken. More importantly, Keanu's leadership had shown everyone, employees and customers alike, that the bank's commitment to integrity wasn't just a slogan, it was a core value. The team had worked tirelessly to implement more rigorous checks and balances within their loan department. Keanu personally oversaw the overhaul of the approval process to ensure that such an issue would never happen again. It was a pivotal moment for the bank, and the news had spread through their customer base. The community programs were flourishing, and local businesses were starting to feel the positive effects of the bank's outreach initiatives. The media, once skeptical, had shifted its tone. Articles and interviews now focused on the bank's efforts to restore trust, with many praising Keanu's determination and his hands-on approach. But the real proof of their progress came when Keanu received a call from Ethan Shaw, the investor from New York. "Keanu, I have to say, I'm impressed," Ethan said, his voice warm. "I wasn't sure what to expect, but I see you've made real progress. The bank is on the right track. We're ready to invest more if you're interested." Keanu sat up straighter in his chair. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The next chapter was beginning to take shape. "I appreciate your faith in us, Ethan," Keanu replied. "But it's not just about the investment. It's about the kind of bank we want to build. We're not just looking to grow in terms of size, we want to make a difference. And I believe we're on the right path," Ethan chuckled. "You've got the right mindset, we'll support you, but just know, this is a long-term game. We're in for the ride. Let's do this." As Keanu hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pressure was still there, of course. Rebuilding an institution's reputation was no small feat, and there would always be obstacles along the way. But Keanu knew deep down that they were on the right track. He looked out at the city skyline once more, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. It had been a long journey, one filled with doubt, fear, and uncertainty, but through it all, Keanu had learned something invaluable. True success wasn't just about wealth or recognition. It was about the impact you had on the world around you, the people you helped, and the legacy you left behind. The sun had risen, and with it, the bank had entered a new era. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Keanu felt ready for whatever came next. He had faced his fears, his failures, and his doubts, and now he was leading the charge into a future he had once only dreamed of. As Keanu stood up from his desk, ready to meet with Olivia and Grace to discuss their next steps, he couldn't help but think of how far they had come. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him or the bank. They had become a reminder of the power of resilience, the strength of leadership, and the importance of staying true to one's values. The world had tried to break them, but in the end, it had only made them stronger. And as Keanu walked out of his office and down the hall toward the conference room, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough?